Hey, this is our first kind of supplemental video for the class. Why do you have to watch a video and read and come to class? Because you're going to get different things from those different layers. When you read your material, you're really going to get the detail. This is to kind of help highlight some things in there, draw some things to your attention, maybe explain some things. You'll don't tell anybody I said this, but you'll survive if you don't watch the video. But it's helpful, especially if you miss. If you miss class, the video will be a little bit helpful. And then in the class, we really are going to take more time to interact, and I'm going to give you some more concepts. Concepts are it's much better to explain concepts in person when we can talk together. On a video is not always the best way to explain a concept because I can't see and tell and get feedback from you if you get it. I can't check for your understanding. This video is we're going to go through the factual events of the entire Old Testament, which is a lot. But again, remember from the intro video, remember that we said this is a fly through in order to get the big picture. The goal is to get the big picture. So we are on page 6 if you want to either follow along or just watch this before or after you read. We're on page 6. And so the Bible begins with creation, right? It begins with 3 famous words, in the beginning. And so in the beginning clues us into the fact that the Bible is telling us a story. In the beginning of the story, in the beginning of all things, in the beginning of time, God created the heavens and the earth. And so the Bible goes through 7 days, seven days of creation. And the way that I'm kind of describing those here is in the first 3 days, God shapes creation. And in the second 3 days, God populates creation. So first 3 days, light, water and atmosphere, earth, vegetation. In the second 3 days, sun, moon, stars, sea creatures, birds, animals, humans. And so we have this repeated thing, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. So we see some things that are repeated here and some things that are different. When you're reading the Bible as a story, you always want to look for is something repeated and then different the next time. So sometimes people go, why is the Bible so repetitive? Part of it is so that you see the pattern, and then often so that you notice when the pattern breaks, when the pattern is not normal. So it was good, it was good, it was good, everything was good, and then something the Bible says is not good, and that's that man should be alone. So God creates a helper fit for him. And so he creates a woman. It's going to be significant when we go back and we talk about the meanings underneath these things, about the fact that this woman is not named right up front. Her name is not given to her until chapter 3. There's a lot of meaning behind that. I'm not going to explain it right now, but we want to maybe put that in our brain. This is a very dense section right here. There's a lot that goes on. Obviously, the creation of the world. It is not, I don't want you to read this, and a lot of people do in our day and age, as this super duper detailed science textbook version of all of how God created the world. It doesn't explain all the details of how he created the world. It leaves some dark. It leaves some mysterious to us. And I think we should remember this is definitely, nobody's there at the time watching all of this happen. So God is revealing this to Moses, who wrote Genesis, miraculously, or revealing it down the line, from somebody who'd reveal it, and reveal it, right? Reveal it to Adam, and then down the line. Whichever way it's transmitted, we don't know all the details. God doesn't seem to have seen fit to give us all the details. And so we want to be careful reading this as a very strict scientific textbook version of things. I'm not saying that what's here is not factually true. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is it's not the entirety maybe of all the detail that we might want. And so people can spend a lot of time and even, entire lifetimes trying to figure out all of, what's here and not here. What we want to do for our purposes in this class is to really go, okay, what's being highlighted here as part of what's important. We're going to take what's given to us as important to the story. Sorry, let me click over so you can see the textbook here on page 6. God creates a tree of life, and we're again, even in kind of the setup of things, there's a lot of details where we're like, wait, what's a tree of life? And God lets Adam name the animals, and he gives him, a job to do, and tells Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. Again, her name is not Eve at this point. And so everything's really good. And again, we're not interpreting at this point, so I just want you to get kind of the facts of the matter in this first section. So that's starts off with creation in Genesis 1 and 2. By Genesis 3, we have what we call the fall. That is not a biblical term. It's not something that's in the Bible where it says, and then man fell. We call it the fall, or the fall of man. And that's in Genesis 3. And so the Bible story moves pretty quickly from things are good, things are good, things are good, to things are no longer so good. Basically, what happens is this being in the form of a serpent begins to talk to the woman and say, hey, did God really say there's going to be consequences if you eat of this one particular tree? She says, hey, we've been told, she doesn't say hey, it's not in the Bible, but you kind of mean, we've been told that if we eat of this or even touch this, we will surely die. And so she's told by this serpent being, this snake being, God knows you won't die. God lied to you. You won't die. You will actually become like God. And she says, oh, that sounds pretty good. She goes ahead and takes of this fruit, gives to Adam. He eats of it. And the Bible describes their nature, their inner understanding of themselves being changed. They realize they're naked. They had been naked, but they didn't know it because they didn't know what clothes were. They didn't know the difference. They begin to feel this need to hide all of a sudden, hide from one another. They put fig leaves on as clothing. They hide from God when he comes to visit them. They begin to blame, shift onto each other. Adam says, hey, it was, again, they didn't say hey. I'm saying hey. It was this woman that you gave me, sort of blaming her and God in the same breath. She says it was the serpent that deceived me. And God pronounces a curse. We call it a curse on them. It's actually at that point. So he pronounces this curse, and we're going to talk about this when we come back. Is really important. This is a very dense section right here, but I just want to tell you what the curse is. He tells the woman that she will have pain in, you could translate it either child conception or childbirth. Either way, she's going to have pain in reproduction. Adam is going to have difficulty in labor and work and getting the ground to bear fruit for him. The serpent is told that he will go around on his belly. It's a little bit mysterious. It's, kind of throws us for a little bit of a loop. Does that mean this serpent had legs? People say, was it then a dragon? Was it, does that mean that all snakes before that had legs and then because of this they didn't? I'm going to be honest, I don't really know. That's not super duper clear. Now, you might be asking, I'm going to talk about this more in the class. We're going to use this as a launching pad for a whole concept of how you read the Bible. Andrew, why did you say snake being or serpent? And if I were to hit back at you and say, well, that's what the Bible says, and I've had people say, well, isn't it the devil? What we're doing in and I'm going to explain this much more thoroughly when you come to the class, we're not interpreting right now. And you go, well, that's not an interpretation. Isn't that the devil in the form of a serpent? Well, actually, that's an interpretation because that's not what's written in the text. Am I saying that's right or wrong? You're gonna have to come to class to find out what my opinion is. But at the same time, we're really prone to read into what's written, things that we've been told, even though they're not written into the text. And we want to be careful with that. And we're going to talk actually a lot about that when you come to class. So yes, just because you watch the video and read doesn't mean you're not going to benefit also from being in person. So God tells them that they're going to have this curse, but he also says that Eve will have a seed. He then refers to this seed, this descendant, as male, who will crush the head of this serpent, but the serpent will bruise or damage or wound, however we translate that word, the man's heel. So, weird, kind of mysterious. What does that mean? Adam then names his wife Eve, which means something like life giver or mother of all living, something like that. Why do I say something like that? Hebrew words can be a little hard to translate. And so basically, though, what's going to be important in a few weeks is that Adam names his wife after God pronounces these punishments on them. And that will be really significant later on, but we're not going to describe why right now. God provides animal skins for them. They'd been wearing fig leaves. God provides animal skins, and then he banishes them from the garden. It says, and it tells us why. It says, in order that they don't eat of the tree of life. So they have a tree of what's called the knowledge of good and evil. I think I forgot to actually mention that in the beginning, and I just sort of started talking about it. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. Because they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and in doing so rebelled against God, God says, I'm going to not let you back into this area so that you don't also eat of the tree of life and live forever. Those are the facts that we're given. There's a ton there. We're going to actually spend probably more time on that when we interpret in a few weeks than on any other single thing until we get to Jesus and the life of Jesus. We'll spend most of our time on him, but second place actually goes to this story right here, because this is going to set up everything. So as you're reading the story, we want to really get a good picture. And this is, I will give you one concept here in the video that's called the 10-minute mark. Now, all the Bible doesn't work this way, but if you want extra homework, if you're just bored and you really love watching videos and you're tired of my videos, or you will be, I promise you, go watch a romantic comedy. Go watch what in the world, Andrew, does a romantic comedy have to do with the Bible? I'll tell you. Romantic comedies work on the same kind of structure most of the time. So we are introduced to usually our main character, often a woman, right? We're introduced to this person and we get to know what's normal for them. We get to see their normal daily life and just kind of what their situation is. In most of these movies, then it's called the 10-minute mark. It's not always exactly 10 minutes, but it's within the very beginning of the movie. Some event will take place. Something will happen. This character will lose their job. This character will meet somebody. This character will break up with a significant other. This character will have a tragedy happen. Something will happen that sets up the rest of the movie, and it's always a significant event. Because we've just gotten a picture of what's normal, and then this breaks what's normal or gives a new normal. Romantic comedies, again, other movies work this way too, but romantic comedies are pretty much almost a guarantee. They then will go into Act 1 where everything kind of builds off of that 10-minute mark. There's an aftermath to it, and we build up usually to some good point. Some good thing happens. Now we're dating, the person that's so wonderful. And then quickly, boom, there'll be a problem. Things will fall apart. We go into what's called Act 2, and it'll be the sad time where, you're eating ice cream and just sad over the breakup. And we as the audience know that, oh my gosh, if they just understood that it's all a big misunderstanding and they could get married and then the movie could end, and why don't they just... That's Act 2, is that kind of bummer. It's the bummer act. Or if you ever watch a trilogy, usually the second movie in a trilogy is kind of darker. And so that's kind of the second act. That second act will culminate it moves into the third act. Third act's usually quick. Third act is when things start to get resolved, things start to solve, and leading up to some final either confrontation. Maybe this couple, now they're dramatically, yelling at each other across, some romantic bridge, and then they, wait, that wasn't no, that was just my brother. Oh, you were only hanging out with your brother. What a misunderstanding. And they move to each other in the middle of the bridge, and they kiss, and that's sort of the resolution of that conflict. And then we have what's usually called the denouement. at the end of the movie, it's kind of and this is what happens ever after, or we get ready for a wedding. I'm not a screenwriter, so if you're like, Andrew, this movie sounds lame, I understand that. I'm making this up. My point is, go watch movies. They have a flow to them. But that 10-minute mark is when everything shifts. And what's important is everything shifts from normal in a way that's going to set up the rest of the story. In the Bible, by the way, please hear me on this, does not work on that romantic comedy outline. It does not fit in neatly like that. But the 10-minute mark thing kind of does work because in the 10-minute mark, it's the fall. And so we go, okay, everything's normal and everything's good. Boom, here comes something that's not normal and not good. And then God starts to signal, I'm going to do something about this in the future. Oh, you and me reading the Bible as a story should immediately click in and go, okay, I need to understand this because this is what's setting me up for the rest of the story. I hope that makes sense. As I just said, I shouldn't explain concepts on video, but there I go. All right, we move forward, and really what happens is that the descendants of Adam and Eve, really, we just see the spill out of the sin, and so their kids, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, but they have more children. People often ask, like, how are they populating the world? Are people marrying their sisters and brothers? Yes. The gene pool would have been more deep, obviously, and let's be honest, the only other way is that God would create a bunch of people right away. He chose not to do that. There is you'll see a common theme in the Bible that God will often start with something very small, some very small foothold, some very small thing, and allow that to grow. This seems to be something God likes. He starts with 2 people and he allows them to populate the world. Jesus talks about this small seed that grows into a big tree, just as the kingdom of God, he's going to say, starts with just a small group of people who follow Jesus and is going to grow huge and big, which we've seen, obviously, the church, throughout the last 2,000 years. The Bible even talks about sin that way. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. A little sin, a little foolishness grows and grows and grows. And so yes, my short answer, yes, people are marrying their brothers and sisters. But as they populate, as they grow, sin grows with them. Wickedness grows with them. And so we come to this time where God is kind of pressing reset. So we get to the flood, and God allows a flood to flood the whole world, but he saves just 8 people. Noah, Noah's sons, and their wife. Noah's wife, Noah's sons, and Noah's son's wife. So 3 sons, 3 daughters-in-law, and Noah and his wife are the only people rescued from this. So God kind of presses reset. Again, he's repopulating, but he's using this small number. God likes to start small and let it grow. Yes, so he's kind of pressing reset. This is the first time as we're reading the Bible as a story, we also see this really strong kind of callback to really the beginning. When in the beginning in Genesis, it says that the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, was hovering above the waters and began to form them and form the land. With the flood, we have this boat hovering above the waters again. And so really what's going on is God is sort of resetting almost all the way back to the beginning, about as close as he could get back to the beginning of creation, back to just water. And then he would dry out the land from there. And so really we want to notice those patterns when we're reading the Bible. From Noah's sons, the book of Genesis begins with a genealogy, and sometimes we go, man, genealogy seems so boring, but there's so many of them in the Old Testament, and I think we'll talk later about why those are so important. But we have really, this is kind of a special one here in Genesis, where it begins to spell out how from just these people, all these people in the Near East at the time were multiplying and multiplying, and you'll recognize some names in there like Egypt, but it's a person named Egypt, and so we believe this is the ancestor of the Egyptians, and so the Bible spells this out. However, these people begin to and this we'll mention again in the future, but God had told Adam and Eve to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. He says that again to Adam and Eve. However, these people in a place called Babel, or what would later be called Babylon, are trying to come together. Instead of spreading out, come together. Instead of honoring God, honor themselves, trying to build a tower to heaven instead of connecting with the Lord. And God confuses their language and splits them into groups. And so at the Tower of Babel scene, really what we have is the beginning then of these groups. This is a little bit confusing sometimes if you read Genesis 10 and then 11, which is right how we would go from the first part to the second part. It starts with, if you go, 9, 10, and 11. So if you go in 9, you get all of these groupings, the thisites and the thoseites and all these kind of people groups. And then Genesis 10 continues that. Genesis 11, you get the Tower of Babel. And so it's saying everybody was one big group. And you're like, you just listed a bunch of groups. Well, if you read here on page 8, this section that says fast forward, all these things that say reading the story in your handbook really are that. They're little notes on kind of concepts that you're going to need and maybe aren't used to as you read the Bible as a story. Just some of the rules of the game, if you will. And so here, what's happened is we have kind of a flashback. So we've jumped around just a little bit. So what's going on is the Bible is saying, here's all these groups, and then in the next chapter it's kind of going, and here's how they went from being one to being multiple groups. That makes a lot of sense to us if we watch movies and watch TV and things, and we are used to flashbacks, or how there's kind of those how did we get here kind of scenes. And so that's really all this is. It's not some giant mistake, it's not some giant contradiction, it's not even some giant mystery. It really is the Bible going, here, let's organize this into a list of people. Oh, and by the way, here's how we got all those different people. Then in chapter 12, and in class, we'll talk about kind of this idea of zooming in on one person. We're going to zoom in on one person named Abram. And what I love about it is he's just sort of, it's really weird. He just sort of gets introduced. There was this dude. And you're like, what? Who is this dude? He's just a dude named Abram. Well, why is he important? I don't know. He just gets he just gets focused on, and we will talk about that more. But we're going to talk in class about the concept of when the Bible slows down and focuses on somebody, it's because they're going to advance the story. They're going to be important, and we should clue into that. So we get into Abraham. Abraham is a huge part of the book of Genesis. He covers all the way from chapter 12 to chapter 25. Some people have said that chapters 1 through 11 are just set up, getting us ready to talk about Abraham. It's just setting the stage for Abraham. I don't know, but he's definitely clearly very important. So Abraham is, we cover a lot of his life. We cover a lot of his story. I'll let you read here the details. But as you read, just know that he's super important. Know that a lot of things are going to point back to him as we go through the story. Abraham moves from where he is in Ur of the Chaldeans, which is out kind of Babylon way. We don't exactly know where Ur is, full disclosure. Scholars can't actually pinpoint it on a map. There's a couple options for where they think that was. And another thing that you should know that sometimes is an accusation against the Bible when it says things like Ur of the Chaldeans, that's a later term than the area would have been called in Abraham's day. This is something we should understand. Areas in the Bible are constantly conquered, and so they get renamed stuff. Okay? Think about this. We're in Southern California. This at one point was Mexican territory, right? And so now it's called California, or now it's called, we call, Riverside County. It wasn't always called Riverside County. Does that make sense? So sometimes you're talking about the same place, but at different times. So if I described to you, for instance, if I said, if I said, um, I don't know if this will even make sense. New York. New York used to be called New Amsterdam. There's a famous governor there, is a Dutch governor named Peter Stuyvesant. So if I said Peter Stuyvesant lived in New York, that's true, but at the time he lived there, it would have been called New Amsterdam. I hope that kind of makes sense. Here's why I tell you that. People have come against the Bible and said, well, Abraham, why would they call it Ur of the Chaldeans? That's not the name they would have called it in Abraham's time. And, we kind of go, well, so what? What Moses is doing is he's explaining this in terms that they would understand, not in terms of what it was called at that time before, but in the time that he's writing. I hope that kind of makes sense. But that's important because it is an accusation that gets leveled against the Bible sometimes, that it has its names and places wrong. Abraham moves to a place called Haran, and then eventually down into what was at the time called Canaan. We would now call it Israel, and he moves through Israel, and God tells him, all this that you're around, all this that you see, everything your foot touches will one day be yours. But then because of famine, Abraham goes down into Egypt. That's going to be a repeated thing. Famine, difficulty, sends us into Egypt. It's going to happen several times in the Bible story, but the first one is with Abraham. Abraham and his wife have been promised by God that they'll have an abundance of children. The two most important chapters for Abraham are 12 and 15. Genesis 12 and 15. 12, God introduces himself to Abraham and tells him all these things God's going to do. He's going to bless him with many descendants. He's going to just generally bless him. He's going to give him a special land. Through his descendants, all the families of the earth, is how it's put, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed. And anybody who blesses Abraham will be blessed, and anybody who curses Abraham will be cursed. And so as we get, when we get to Abraham, that promise, we're going to come back to that when we go back and interpret. But I want you to understand that that's super important. Then in chapter 15, God makes a covenant with Abraham. He makes a solemn agreement with Abraham. That solemn agreement to be faithful to Abraham is going to be repeated then to Abraham's sons. And so it's sort of the family heirloom, the family heritage, this thing that God has promised is really promised to one family. Later, that family is going to grow very, very large, but it's still really within that family that God is making this promise of faithfulness, coupled with the promise that through that family, all people will be blessed somehow. Do we know exactly how as we're reading through the Bible? No. And I'm going to talk more about that in class, but we don't know yet. So hold on to your horses. Okay. Abraham eventually does have a son, but before that, he tries to have a son with a handmaiden, which is not God's plan. And so it doesn't go well for the handmaiden, the son, Abraham, or Abraham's wife. Not for anybody. But Abraham's wife in her old age does eventually have a son, and this is the son that God has promised, and has promised that many will come through him. And then God tells Abraham to go ahead and sacrifice his son. So in Genesis 22, Abraham is told to sacrifice his son. He goes ahead and does it. Hebrews tells us that he understood that even if he killed his son, God would bring his son back from the dead, because Abraham had that much faith in God fulfilling the promise that he had made. So Abraham dies. When he dies, he has a little tiny bit of land in that area that God promised him, but not much to speak of. He has a cave, he has a well, he has a little field, but he doesn't really have anything like what God has promised him. He's wealthy, and he's wealthy for the day, but not anything compared to what God has promised to give him. And so we move on to what we call the patriarchs. Patriarchs, again, not a term in the Bible, but a term that we use, and that means the fathers. So Abraham, Isaac, his son, Jacob, Isaac's son, not Isaac's son like a last name, Isaac's son, Jacob, Jacob's son, Joseph. Um, each of these has, these besides Isaac, they have siblings, but God's going to advance the story, advance that family promise, that heirloom through these specific lines: Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. And then we are going to spend a lot of time in Genesis talking about Joseph. Joseph gets tons of coverage in the book of Genesis. And so if you want to read through the book, you'll see that, wow, this guy must be pretty important as well. We again, when we go back through and go, okay, what's the meaning under all these things? We'll see why Joseph is so important. Isaac, not a lot of coverage, not a ton of story about Isaac. Some, but not a lot. Isaac actually looks a lot like Abraham in his life, in the sense that he and his wife also suffer infertility. Isaac, though, a little bit better. He prays for his wife. His wife conceives. But so he doesn't have a son first by another woman as Abraham did. And then Isaac, also like Abraham, goes into Egypt with his wife. Also like Abraham, which is really interesting. Both of them lie to a local king. Abraham twice, Isaac once, lies to a local king, saying that his wife is his sister so that they won't steal his wife from him. So we're seeing some parallels, but with a little improvement. I give you a note there about names and titles in the Bible. There's a guy here, what we're talking about is a guy named Abimelech. That's likely just a title. So is Pharaoh, so is Caesar, so in a way is Herod. Not sometimes we're like, how many of these people? There's like a million pharaohs, and there's a million guys named Herod, and there's a million guys named. No, it's just it becomes a title, right? If you'd be like, man, I'm in 1,000 years if people are studying American history, there's all these guys whose first name is president. No, it's a title. Does that make sense? Of course it does. All right. Another thing that's really important in the Bible is blessings. So you and I, we sneeze, we say, God bless you. We sit down and eat, and we quickly pray and call that a blessing. That's all fine and good and well. The sneeze thing is kind of superstitious, but whatever. But blessings in the Bible are a super big deal. And they actually are, they really advance the spirituality of the plot. So what's going on when someone blesses somebody, you should actually see that as kind of a form of a prophetic statement, that this is what will be. So there's this blessing that gets passed. So God blesses Abraham and tells him he'll be a blessing and he'll be blessed. This blessing passes to Isaac. Isaac mistakenly gives it to. Sorry, let me fix that. Not mistakenly. Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. When Isaac goes blind, Jacob tricks his father out of giving a birthright or an earthly inheritance that his brother was supposed to get. Jacob tricks him into promising it to Jacob. Later, after that birthright, that earthly inheritance has been promised to Jacob, later on, Isaac knowingly gives his blessing, his spiritual inheritance to Jacob. Okay, so Jacob is going to be prominent. This is also a common theme in the Bible. Very common is that the lesser, the younger, the weaker, the smaller is given honor, significance over the greater. So Jacob, the younger, weaker brother, is given honor over his brother Esau, the stronger, older brother. So these blessings, though, are kind of prophetic. In, I believe it's chapter 39 of Genesis. Could be 49. Oh, it must be 49. Jacob blesses his sons, and in doing so, he kind of prophesies over them their future. For instance, he talks to his son Judah and says that Judah will become like a young lion raised up, meaning that he will come to prominence among his brothers. Judah is not the oldest brother, not the most significant brother in an earthly way of thinking, but he will be a royal, kingly, prominent brother among all the others. The other thing that you should understand in the concept, and this is going to be really significant later on, and I'll explain it actually a lot more thoroughly later on, but in the Bible, when it mentions an individual, that individual can represent their descendants. So if it says God promised this to Abraham, it can also go for the descendants of Abraham. If Jacob is making a prophetic blessing over Judah, it also goes for the descendants of Judah as well. And there's more to it than that, but we'll get to that later. All right. You got some maps here. If you like maps, you can nerd out on that. Okay, we're going to move forward because I do want you to read this. I'm not going to read it all to you. Moving forward, Joseph. You may be familiar with the story of Joseph. Joseph is sold by his brothers into slavery in Egypt. He rises to a place of prominence. There is a kind of a series of famines in the land, but through God revealing the future to Joseph, Joseph has been given this huge administrative position over all of Egypt, and uses that to store up grain, store up food for the future. And so when the world is hungry and looking for food, the place they can get it is in Egypt because of Joseph's prophetic foresight, because the Lord spoke to him. And so Joseph really is going to be, he really rescues, who knows how many people, probably millions of people, I don't know. But he also is confronted with the brothers who sold him and are coming back for food, don't recognize him, and Joseph ends up forgiving them. And so Joseph's story is given a ton of space. It must be pretty significant. I'll give you on 15 a little place to chart out the patriarchs if you want to kind of quiz yourself and see if you can do it. See, Abraham married whom? Who is Abraham's son and who did he marry? Who are their two sons? I give you Esau. Who's the other one? And then I give you all the other guys there. Quick note, if you care about this is a little bit obscure and maybe doesn't even matter, and you maybe never noticed it. Couple things that are interesting here with the 12 tribes. Number one, we have Joseph as a son, but there's no tribe of Joseph. If you look at the map, where's my map? My map? No, my map's later. I'll get to it later. There's no tribe of Joseph. The reason is his inheritance gets split among his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. They get two areas when Israel moves into their promised land. And so that's where the tribe of Joseph goes. So they're kind of two half tribes taking his place. Interestingly, later, it's kind of way later, in the book of Revelation, it mentions the tribes and it leaves out Dan. No one's very sure why. There are some theories. But anyway, we move on. Exodus. We fast forward. This also happens in the Bible narrative a lot. It might be, one book closes and the next one opens, and it might be way later. It also might be like not way later. And so you have to really kind of pay attention. You have to watch, you have to follow the details that are given for you there and see, are we way later or not? So we're about 430 years later. So at the close of Genesis, we have 70 people going down into Egypt, and those people multiply and multiply and multiply. They multiply, and here's what's interesting, and the Bible even notes this. It's kind of something we don't really notice that's there in Genesis, but it says that the Egyptians found shepherds to be icky gross. It doesn't say icky gross, but they wouldn't have intermarried with shepherds. Well, guess what job the early Hebrews have is their shepherds. So they're kind of preserved there in Egypt. They aren't intermarrying with the Egyptians necessarily. Um, and so a little bit, and you see that a little bit um, with some of the people in the Bible, but largely they're preserved as a family, as a unit, right? As a bloodline. Okay. Um, we move even forward from we move forward from there. This new Pharaoh comes to power. It says he doesn't know Joseph. Probably means he doesn't know of Joseph because Joseph has been gone for a while. And so I'm sorry about my microphone. It's slipping on me. Sorry about that. Here we go. He doesn't seem to know of Joseph. And so we don't know. There's, some people say this is when a foreign group actually took over Egypt. And so maybe this Pharaoh is not really Egyptian, and that's why he doesn't know Egyptian history. We don't know. Nevertheless, that's not the point. The point is he begins to really subjugate the Israelites. So were the Israelites slaves the entire time they were in Egypt? No, that's not accurate. The second thing that's not accurate is people say the Israelites made the pyramids. No, not accurate. The Bible is clear that they were making storehouse cities, so warehouse cities. So if you go to, any modern city now, I mean, we have them in Marietta, the kind of industrial warehouse districts. Now imagine that more like city size, the city size industrial warehouse district. That's what they're building. Um, Ramses and Pithon are the names of the cities that they're building. That's what they're doing. They're enslaved, and it gets worse and worse because as Moses comes along and asks for them to be able to go into the wilderness, things get worse and worse. Here's how the narrative goes. There's a guy named Moses, right? You may or may not know this story. He's born. He's a Hebrew is the term, descendant of Abraham. He's protected when the Pharaoh is so concerned that, hey, with all of these babies being born, they're going to grow up and they're going to rebel against us, and so we better kill off the male children because they're the ones, right, who are going to one day get swords and rebel against us. Well, Moses is part of a group of male children who are rescued, who are secreted away from all of this. Moses ends up being found by the daughter of probably one of the many daughters of the Pharaoh, and raised in the palace, and so raised to be an Egyptian. At about the age of 40, he sees an Egyptian abusing another Hebrew, kills that Egyptian. When he's found out, he flees into the wilderness for quite a while, about 40 years. While he's there, he marries a woman in the wilderness, kind of is a shepherd under her father-in-law, and then stumbles upon this burning bush, which turns out to be the Lord speaking to him, tells him to go back and tell Pharaoh to let the people go. And Moses says, I can't go speak like that. I'm not that good at speaking. God says that his brother Aaron can go with him. Moses and Aaron meet up in the wilderness, proceed into Egypt together, and things don't go well, right? And so if you may know this story, but they begin by saying, let the people go out and worship. Here's what's interesting is that's not really what God told them to say. God really told them, go tell Pharaoh that I'll punish him if he doesn't let my people go. He says that right up front. They go in, water down the message, tell Pharaoh, we just want to go out and worship in the wilderness for a while. He says no. They go back and forth, and there's a series of plagues, these miraculous plagues that through Moses and Aaron, God brings upon the Egyptians. Each of these plagues relate. So this is one of those things where you're like, I never knew that. I never saw that. But the people who read the Bible originally would have understood this much better than us because they would have had an understanding of Egyptian culture. I have it here on a chart for you on page 16. In blue here, each of the 10 plagues relate in some way to something that one of the Egyptian gods should have been in control over. So what's going on here? God is showing his power over not only the Pharaoh, but over the Egyptian gods. If you ever like, man, these plagues seem so random and weird. Yeah, they're all bad, but what's going on with them? That's what's going on under the surface. And so I have that little list for you there. Even up to the last thing is that the firstborns die. Well, Pharaoh's firstborn son would have been seen as kind of divine. So when you were a pharaoh, you were semi-divine, and you were a pathway between the human realm and the divine realm. So Pharaoh's son as well, God is showing his power over all things that the Egyptians held to be sacred and divine, right? So God leads his people out. This is the institution of what's called the Passover, which is going to be the first instituted and, perhaps the most important Jewish and Israelite festival that they're going to celebrate over and over. There'll be times in the Bible where they say, man, we haven't been doing that. We haven't celebrated that. Like when they come into conquer the land of Israel, then called Canaan. Hey, we need to celebrate Passover again. And so they have one then. So really that Passover, why does God have them celebrate that over and over? This part of the story must be important. If God is going to constantly call them back to this part of the story, we must really need to pay attention to the fact that, God is taking them out of bondage in Egypt. That's going to be important. Again, we'll talk about why these things are significant later. I'll give you a map on 17, just kind of tracing a little bit of what's going to go on for the next several books of the Bible, actually. So this is a super duper duper synopsis. I give 7 little kind of waypoints on the map. Number 1, the people leave Egypt, right? They leave their bondage in those cities in Egypt, and then go to point 2 you see on the map there, which is where they cross the Red Sea or the Reed Sea. Some people have gotten confused because the Red Sea kind of proper, if we go down south a little bit, is ginormous. That doesn't mean that God couldn't miraculously have them cross a ginormous body of water, but they're actually crossing at a smaller area up north, most likely. And so maybe we should understand that. So they cross over. The Egyptians try to follow them, and God closes the water and kills them. They move into a place called Sinai and a mountain called Sinai, or sometimes called Horeb. This is another tough Bible thing. Some places have more than one name. Sometimes that's because different people groups call it a different name. Sometimes it's because it gets called different things in different periods of Bible history. Sometimes it's in different languages. Oh my goodness, it can be hard, but they go to a mountain called Sinai or Horeb. We don't exactly know where that is. There are ideas and there are theories. Actually, the theories sometimes vary pretty wildly in where they think it is. But typical thought is that it's the kind of the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula there, somewhere around my point 3 there. From there, so there they get the law given to them on Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments, and then the laws that really spell out and flesh out those 10 Commandments are given there. The people move on up north to a place called Kadesh Barnea, number 4 there on the map. And from there, they send spies into the land they're trying to get to, this land of Canaan that we now call Israel. Those spies, it doesn't fit on this map. I apologize a little bit. Those spies went up north beyond what's on this map. But I don't have a bigger map because I didn't make this map. So I'm sorry. But the spies go up beyond this map and then back down, basically say the land is super duper agriculturally just awesome, but the people there are scary and the cities there are too big and we can never take it and God won't help us. And so let's not do what God told us to do. And the Israelites end up, God has them then wander around in the wilderness for 40 years in order that the generation that wasn't faithful to God to enter the land would die away so that their children could take it. God still wants his promise fulfilled that they would have that land, but now he's going to give it to the children who weren't guilty of not trusting him. He also preserves the life of Caleb and Joshua, who'd be pretty old, especially Caleb. But when they went into the land, those two who had been faithful got to go into the land. So they wander around. Not a big area, by the way. If you look at this map, this is not a huge area. In point 6 there, I kind of stuck it right in the middle of the Sinai Peninsula because they're kind of wandering all around in there for 40 years. And so not a huge, they could cross it. They're originally about 11 months to a year when they originally leave Egypt to when they arrive at the border of the land. It's only about a year. And then it's 40 years of wandering after that. Then when things are ready, they come back up, but they come up this time now to the east side. So you see here number 7. So they're going to come up and around Israel to the eastern side, and they're going to pause. And when they pause, Moses is going to repeat the law to that next generation before they go into the land. This has a bit of a different tone to it. The first time they got the law is very like clinical, very cut and dry. The second time Moses repeats the law 40 years later, it's more like a locker room speech. It's more of like rallying the troops. There's a lot of, you can hear a heaviness, an urgency. He really is imploring them to, follow the Lord and be faithful, especially when they're tempted with idols and false gods in the land. That is the book of Deuteronomy. And so what's happening there is they're pausing to the east side of the land before they go in. Moses is repeating the law to them. Moses is actually going to die outside the land. He's not able to go in because he disobeyed God in the wilderness. And then the people will proceed from the east into the land of Canaan to the west, crossing the Jordan River. The Jordan River will part for them and dry for them, very similar to the Red Sea as they go in. So we're watching those patterns in the story that God is miraculously helping them have their blessings. While they're in the wilderness, the people are told, and it's the whole design of this is given in the Old Testament. They're told to erect what's called a tabernacle. This is going to be a special tent in the middle of all the tents of the tribes of Israel, where God will meet with his people. It's where they're going to make sacrifices. It's where the presence of the Lord in the form of a cloud is going to hover above. He's seen, it's not, I shouldn't say he's seen, like this is God revealing his actual image, but God is giving them it's mysterious. He's giving them a cloud to follow by day and a pillar of fire to follow by night. And the Bible says when it would stop, that's where they would set up camp. So they'd move, from place to place to place, and then stop, where God would have them stop for a time, sometimes a long time, sometimes a short time. Every time they would stop, one of the tribes, the tribe of Levi, was in charge of setting up and tearing down and setting up and tearing down this tent structure. While they're in the wilderness, there's these two guys, Bezalel and Oholiab, and they craft this whole thing. They're making, an ark where the Ten Commandments are kept in this inner sanctum. It's a kind of a construct of a tent within a tent we get down, there's an outer wall you can see there. Sacrifices were made there in that outer court. And then as they would go in, there was a place where the priests would go in, and there's, they would light incense. There's a lampstand. There's a table with bread on it. All of this is kind of like, what does that mean? Actually, the Bible takes a long time to start to really spell out what some of those things mean. And then there's an inner sanctum where that ark is. That ark is where they kept the Ten Commandments. Above it, there were the form of two angels. The Bible calls that the mercy seat. So they would move this from place to place. When they go into the land, they put it in a place called Shiloh for many years. Shiloh's kind of becomes the capital for a while. Eventually, Eventually, they took it to Jerusalem and would later replace it with a permanent temple, which is largely the same structure, same function, largely the same structure, a little bit different. But this is sort of the mobile temple, mobile place of meeting with God, mobile place of sacrifices. So I describe here some of the stuff that happens in the wilderness. There's some complaining against Moses. God punishes people. Other nations attack them. They fight back. You can kind of read through that. Quick note here: law and history. If you've ever read a really old novel, like from the early 1800s, they're super duper duper long. And part of the reason they're super duper duper long is that some of them will be telling you a story and telling you a story, and then pause and give you tons of nonfiction in the middle. So, for example, if you've ever read, I think one of the longest books I've ever read is, I hope I pronounce it right, Les Miserables. Super long book. In that book, it talks about these two characters that had years and years and years ago interacted at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. The book then, instead of just saying that and moving on, stops and describes the Battle of Waterloo for like tons of pages. And you're reading this and you're like, no wonder they make abridged versions of these things sometimes, because you don't need all this. If you've ever read Moby Dick will tell you a story about whalers and then pause and give you tons of information about whales. And you're like, I don't really need this for the story. Now, the Bible is similar but different. What the Bible will do is it'll give you narrative, and especially in the first 5 books, pause and then explain the law. For instance, the people are going here and they wind up at Sinai, and Moses goes up to hear the law from the Lord, and this is what he heard, and then we get the law. And then the Lord described to Moses how the tabernacle should be made, and here's what he said, and you're like, boom, 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 tabernacle. The difference is that is really important. It's not the Battle of Waterloo, it's not, whale species, but at the same time, what I want you to understand is that the Bible, even in those first 5 books that we sometimes call the law, is primarily still narrative. It's primarily still telling you a story, but it's slipping the law into the story at appropriate points. Why do I tell you that? Because if you're like, I don't think the Bible is telling me a story, sometimes we get lost in those places and don't realize the big picture is it's still telling me a story, just with a strategic pause. Okay. Moses ends up passing on leadership to his number 2 guy named Joshua. And Joshua takes the people again from east to west into the land. We could divide that up into 3 sections. Entering the land in Joshua 1 through 5. Conquering, they start fighting city to city to city in Joshua 6 through 12. That's where you're getting stories like Jericho and the walls falling down. Rahab is a prostitute living in one of those cities who's heard the reputation of these Israelites. Remember, they fought with other people in the wilderness and they escaped the Egyptians, and so they have, for her, kind of a fearsome reputation. She ends up allying herself with them and kind of becomes part of them, and later will actually be in Jesus's genealogy, just as any other Israelite, with the same status. So they conquer the land. They actually have been given a sort of a list of, these are the people groups that you should be nice to. These are the ones that you should kind of be nice to, and these are the ones that you should be really not nice to. And then there's really 1 or 2 in particular that they're told to just completely wipe out. And they don't, by the way. They don't, and it becomes a problem for them for centuries. And then the land is divided up. So we have a conquering phase, and then we have an inheriting phase. So once they've mostly conquered the land, they divide it by tribes. There's a map there for you if you're interested in that. The tabernacle, again, their capital is at a place called Shiloh. Then they move into just a period we call Judges, which is the book of Judges. And so the book of Judges is when they're ruled, and this is what's hard, is we use the word judges. They're kind of judge warlords. So the people are ruled by these judges, and again, yes, they're judges. We don't always see them judging cases in the Bible, but they would have. but they're kind of like warlords, and they fight against other groups, particularly the Philistines. Some of them are pretty good, and they actually start off pretty well, but they get worse and worse as time goes on. And the book of Judges really goes through this cycle. If you read it, the people will fall into idolatry. They'll go after the gods that are, the these local gods. That worship, as I mentioned later in the handbook, is really just despicable and demonic. It involves, sexual immorality, prostitution, cutting of self-mutilation. It involves killing babies. I mean, it was dark, dark, crazy stuff. The people are getting involved with this, and as a result, God allows them then to be subjugated to a particular person. I'm sorry, group. They repent. They get rescued by a judge. God sends a judge to rescue them, and the people get comfortable. And so when they're comfortable, they go back into idolatry again, and we go around and around. What's a little bit tough in the book of Judges is that some of the judges are in only one area. So they weren't over the entire 12 tribes necessarily. They might be in one area. They might have ruled at overlapping a little bit or at different times. So it's a little messier than we maybe like. The point of that is that there's not one ruler over all of Israel at this time. And the book of Judges repeats that a couple times, that's the case. Ruth, the story of Ruth, takes place during this period. And so we have the book of Judges, which is lots of violence and fighting and chaos and just, clamor. And then we have the book of Ruth, which is really kind of restful and peaceful and idyllic. And so when you read that again, remember when we said with Abraham, sometimes the Bible will take, here's the big picture, but then zoom in and catch just one individual. That individual, therefore, is going to be important. All right. After the judges, the last judge, we get Samuel. Samuel is sometimes listed as a judge and sometimes not, but Samuel kind of caps off that period. He's a priest, but he's also a judge. And it's right to list him as a judge because he is described as one, and he's a transitional figure from that period of judges into a period of what's going to be the kingdom. And so Samuel is used by God to anoint a king. The people say, we want a king, and we want a king like all the nations have. Now, when they say that, what does it mean a king like all the nations has? One, tangible. They want a king they can see, touch, taste, and smell, right? He's there, we can see him. God, appears to us as a cloud or fire in the wilderness with our parents, but now we have this tabernacle, but God just seems distant. So I'm reading into this a little bit, but they probably wanted a tangible king. Second, the kings at the time were seen as a pathway to heaven. This was a semi-divine figure that somehow connected the people into heaven, into the realm of gods or whatever. And so maybe they want that. And then the kings at the time are often very despotic, tyrannical, and abusive. And you go, gosh, how could the people possibly want somebody who's despotic, tyrannical, and abusive? That's human nature. We both want to be completely autonomous and do what we want, and we want to be completely subjugated and have somebody conquer us. And those two things we'll talk about later, but those are kind of designed into us. And so they get a king. His name is Saul. Saul starts off mediocre. Saul's main coolness is that he's super tall. Saul is a portrait of he's just completely, what's the word I'm looking for? He's just insecure. Saul is just completely insecure in all ways. He hides. He tries to not be really made king. But eventually he kind of gets things together. He fights the Philistines. He does okay. One of the guys in his kingdom, a young guy named David, starts to rise up, becomes more popular, has a TikTok song made about him, about how he's killed 10,000s of Philistines and Saul's only killed thousands. Saul becomes jealous because, again, he's super insecure. He eventually will try to kill David. David is anointed king by Samuel after Saul rebels against God. Samuel tells Saul, God's done with you as king. Now Saul continues to rule as king, but in God's eyes, that kingship has moved now to David. David is anointed king, but not yet crowned king. He's not yet on a throne. And he actually spends decades running away from Saul, as Saul tries to kill him. David eventually does, when Saul dies, David is kind of made king by all the people. He moves the ark from Shiloh into Jerusalem, makes Jerusalem the capital of Israel, is the first king to truly, fully, really rule over all the tribes. David, later in his reign, has two different sons try to take the kingdom by force. The kingdom, though, passes to Solomon. David wants to give God a house to live in, a temple to live in. God says, "You have too much blood on your hands. Your son, though, will do it." And so David is prophetically given the designs for this temple, which again is similar in form and function to the tabernacle, but different in some ways. Solomon ends up building this temple. It's kind of the glory of Jerusalem. Solomon's reign is one of great wealth, one of great peace. Things are going really well, except for a couple things. Number one, the kings were not supposed to amass chariots and definitely not buy them from Egypt. Solomon does that. The other thing Solomon does, we see in 1 Kings chapter 11, is that his heart is turned to many, many, many different foreign wives and their gods, their foreign idols. And so Solomon begins this trend, this downward trend we're going to see for the rest of the book of Kings, where the kings lead their people towards idols. But when Solomon has this temple and he dedicates it in 1 Kings 8, he prays that this will be a place where both the people of Israel and those who are not actually part of Israel can come and approach God and pray to him. Solomon's reign is kind of a high point, but also the beginning of what's going to be a lot of low points. And we move into the divided kingdom. What's divided about it? Divided kingdom after Solomon is that there is his son Rehoboam basically makes some foolish choices that lead him to tell the people he's going to be extra harsh on them. The people rebel. This is kind of the simplified version. The people rebel. This guy named Jeroboam, who'd been in exile, comes back and was like, "Well, I'll be your king." And a bunch of the Israelites say, "Yes, that sounds great. Let's do that." The kingdom splits into north and south. The north at this point is called Israel, and the south is called Judah. The north is basically 10 tribes, but it's not quite that simple. The south is it's called Judah because Judah is the largest tribe, and it's down south. It remains mostly faithful to God. The tribe of Benjamin is also down south and really aligns themselves with Judah. Almost all of the tribe of Levi, who doesn't have any particular territory and lives kind of all over, the ones who are living up north, most of them moved down south at the time to be on the right side of the border. There's a time where these two kingdoms fight each other. Sometimes they're busy fighting other people. Sometimes they're ignoring each other. This is hundreds of years of history of them being divided. So again, the north is called Israel. The south is called Judah. Best way to explain that. In the American Civil War, it used to be that all the states, or you could call all the states the United States. But then during the Civil War, we kind of call the North the United States and the South the Confederate States. And then when the North wins the war, we again call the whole thing the United States. I'll explain that more in class. North is called Israel. South is called Judah. The northern kings are all bad. There's not a good, faithful king. They all lead the people towards idolatry, some more than others. Some, like Ahab, to the point where he and his wife are actually killing off prophets of the true God. And so things, really, it's really a kind of a just dark, bleak, the northern tribes. The south, some of the kings are good, some are bad. I give you kind of a list. I give you a chronological description of this time so you can read through that. Something to understand is if you read First and Second Kings, you're going to bounce back between the two. So it'll say, and then so and so was king in Israel, and it'll give his reign, but maybe halfway through his reign, somebody else became king in Judah. So the Bible, when it gets to the end of this guy in Israel, will jump back to Judah. And so it jumps back and forth a lot. It can be a little bit confusing. But the main kind of takeaway is the north totally separates from God, actually has a like a false pretend temple where they sacrifice to golden calves, a lot like in the wilderness. The south is more faithful, but not great. And so also during this time there's a lot of prophets that are speaking to the kings. Okay, you can read through this. This gives a little more. When you have prophets like Elijah and Elisha, that's going to be during this time. Elijah and Elisha didn't write anything, but the prophets who did are at kind of the tail end of this time. So the books of prophecy that we have in the Bible really come at the towards the end of this period. God sends Israel, the northern, less faithful, more disobedient tribes, into what we call exile about 100 years before the not 100. I can't do math. Before Judah. What's going on here? What happens is God basically has been warning them and warning them. He's been very patient, and he's going, hey, if you continue down this path, you'll be punished. They continue down that path. And God, what he does is he brings the kingdom or empire of Assyria in. Assyria brings in their people and brings in people from other areas they've conquered. They bring them into Israel in order to mix culture and mix bloodlines and stuff to dilute local culture. Then they bring some of the people from Israel back to Assyria with them. This is kind of done over time. It's not done, in a weekend. So sometimes we think of it as like a super quick singular event. It's not. Later the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, the Levites who were there, they're going to be taken into exile by Babylon. This is a little bit confusing, but it's also not super confusing. Here's what's going on. So I'm going to go to my fish. Where's my fish? I'm going to skip ahead. Let me skip ahead. I'll come back to this later, but I'm going to give you on page 34, you see these fish. At the time, what was going on was that when an empire would rise up, later a bigger, badder empire would conquer it. So the first fish you have there is Assyria. Assyria conquered those northern tribes of Israel. Later, Babylon is going to conquer and take over the Assyrian kingdom, the Assyrian empire. At that time, Babylon will conquer Judah. Later, the Persians will conquer Babylon, and the Persians will actually let the Israelites start to go back to their land. There's a difference in the way that these two groups exiled people. Again, we said that the Assyrians would come in and they would try to mix people together. Later, when Jesus comes on the scene, and we're going to talk about Samaritans next time, the Samaritans are products of that. They're partly Israelite, and they're partly Assyrian or mixed with whoever the Assyrians brought in. And so they're kind of half-breeds, and so they're very hated. Okay. The exile is a kind of a long period. So it's described in 2 Kings 17 through 25. We get the beginning of it. But also the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah, his book Lamentations as well, the book of Esther, the book of Daniel, and then the very end of 2 Chronicles describe this time. By the way, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a retelling of what you get in First and Second Kings. Slightly different perspective on some things, but if you're reading through First and Second Kings and then you get to First and Second Chronicles and you're like, I've read this already. You have, but from a slightly different emphasis and perspective. Okay. The Babylonians exile people differently. So the Babylonians, when they come in, they check your SAT scores. They want to see your resume. They want to know your blood type. They want to know, how good you are at soccer. They want the best and the brightest, and they take the best and the brightest back with them to serve as kind of slave servants in Babylon. That's where, if you read the book of Daniel, Daniel and his friends are from these royal households, and they're kind of the best and brightest, and so they're brought as servants into Babylon. They end up rising up in that, especially Daniel, really high up in that. While he's there, the Persians take over, and he describes that. Daniel's there for pretty much, it's almost the duration of that exile period, which is 70 years. So the people are there for 70 years. You will, if you're reading Esther. Esther, it describes she's hanging out with Persian people, and she's in a place called Susa, and you're like, I'm confused. Why are there Persians all of a sudden? It's not that difficult. The Persians took over Babylon, and then the Persians had their capital. They had a kind of a forward operating capital. On 29 here, you see this. You see Susa here. That's kind of their forward operating capital. So now, right, the president can know what's going on, around the world in an instant, but back then you couldn't. And so they would move the emperor sometimes towards the front line of the empire. In doing that, they had to have a capital for him to be at. So Susa is kind of that. And why is Esther interacting with Persians? Because she's at the later end of the exile when the Persians have taken over. That's all that is. See, not super mysterious. You can ask me questions about that if it doesn't make sense, though. All right. I give you some terms here. You can read through that. What's the difference between Hebrew versus Israelite versus Israel versus Judean versus Jew versus Israeli? Those are all different terms. Okay. I give you some kings here. The Bible describes different kings. Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar are described, especially in Daniel. Those are Babylonians. Then the Persians take over, and we have Darius, Cyrus, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, Artaxerxes. There are other kings in between there, but the Bible didn't see fit. They're not part of what the Bible's focusing on. So there are other Persian kings in there as well. And then if you ever read Near East, it's like a super soap opera, Near Eastern history. So everybody's conquering and killing, and I'm kind of the king, but I'm in exile, or, you're the king, but the brother's really ruling. That stuff happens a lot. So it's a lot messier than I have here. But these are the ones that are in the Bible. And so if you're just nerdy and you're like, who are these people? There they are for you. Give you a little bit of the Persian Empire. And then after the exile, we're gonna mention some things about the exile again later on, because we can't understand the setup of the New Testament unless we understand some things about the exile that I am not mentioning here, and I'll mention later. The people begin to return. So one of the Persian kings, Cyrus, begins to let them return. They return in 3 waves. One under a guy named Zerubbabel, fun to say. Zerubbabel, he brings the people back and they begin to rebuild the temple. Another wave under Ezra, who's a priest. Ezra leads a spiritual revival, continues to oversee the rebuilding of the temple, but also teaches the people the law. And then there's a wave under a guy named Nehemiah, and they rebuild the Jerusalem's wall. Originally, this is interesting, in the Jewish Bible setup, Ezra and Nehemiah were one book. They were seen as one thing. We've separated them out into 2, but they really are one book describing what happened when the people came back. So the people come back, they rebuild the temple, but the Bible says that they were disappointed because their temple was not like it had been under Solomon, not like the one that the Babylonians had broken down. This one was never really reached to its former glory. Even spiritually, the people come back, but they never come back and are completely and totally faithful to the Lord. They come back, and a lot of the people who didn't get exiled, because not everybody got exiled, the people who are still there, a lot of them have married with foreign wives. And there's this difficult story there in Ezra in Nehemiah, where they're made to divorce those wives. And you're like, well, why? Well, I believe because that's how we got this started under Solomon, by marrying foreign wives and then turning to their foreign gods. This, I don't believe, is foreign wives who are super part and parcel of the life and religion of Israel. Ruth is one of those, and that doesn't seem to be a problem. So I believe that these are foreign wives who are pulling away the people towards foreign gods again. So they're made to divorce their wives. There's this revival that goes on. The people return to the Lord, but not 100%. They rebuild the temple, but not to 100% of its glory. And the Old Testament ends with the book of Malachi, and the Malachi brings a charge against the people that they have robbed God, and they say God doesn't love them, and they haven't really ever returned to the Lord. This would be like if you went back maybe to your childhood home, and you're like, gosh, I'm happy to come back, but it's just not the same. Or you broke up with somebody and you got back together, but it's just not the same. And so something else is needed. So the Old Testament kind of closes on this down note, this disappointing note, but it also closes with this prophetic note that somebody, Elijah, mysterious, Elijah is going to come, that God is going to do something again. One thing for you to note here on the bottom of 33, I hope this chart isn't confusing. It may be or may not be. In the Bible, you get these more narrative-driven history books, and then within the time described by those books. So those books are looking back at it, right? So the book of, let's put it this way. The book of 2 Kings is going to give you kind of the end period of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. But during the time described in that book, you get books like Isaiah that were written at that time. Here's my analogy. I can give you a textbook, and maybe it was written last year on maybe on the Holocaust. But then if I had you read the Diary of Anne Frank, which was written during the Holocaust from somebody there, those things could be written at different times. And one gives a perspective looking back historically, and the other gives a perspective at the time of the events at the time, written by somebody then. That's kind of how this works. You have books of prophecy that were written at these times. Same with Psalms, same with Proverbs, Song of Solomon, these books of poetry and wisdom. But then, so they fit within the narrative described in those books of history. I hope that makes sense. I always think it's going to confuse people, and most people seem okay with it. But I give you kind of a chart there. This chart reflects what some say is the chronological order of the writing of these books. The problem is, especially the books of prophecy, we don't always know. Some people say Joel is the first one written. Some people say Obadiah. We don't really know. Next time, we're going to talk about what happens in between the New and Old Testament to set you up for the New Testament. So I'll see you in class. Ask any questions. We're going to do some interacting on some of this. I just wanted to give you kind of a supplemental overview explanation, but please read these pages here up to 34.